just after midnight on the 17th of August, 1870, in the small city of Binghamton, New York, a young clerk named Frederick Myrick was shot through the head over a few bolts of silk. The man who fired that shot would hang for it the following spring, and in the months between, half the country would write to the governor of New York, begging that his life be spared, because the nation had decided he was the most brilliant mind the age had produced. It began as an ordinary robbery. 3 men bored holes through the back door of Halbert Brothers, a dry goods store on the main street, and let themselves into the dark. Silk was the target, light to carry and easy to sell, and 2 clerks slept upstairs to guard the counters, because the merchandise was worth guarding. When the noise woke them, young Myrick came down to defend his employer's stock, and he fought hard for a man who had held the job only a short time. He was barely 18, by one account, a country boy who had come down from the village of Walton, up in the Delaware County hills, to clerk in the city. In the struggle, a pistol went off. Myrick fell, and he did not get up. The fire bell broke the stillness of the city. 3 burglars hurried toward the Chenango River in the dark, and only one of them reached the far bank. By the next morning, the other 2 had been pulled drowned from the shallows, and the man who got across was walking quickly out of town with a satchel and an umbrella, looking for all the world like a respectable traveler caught out by an early train. His name, when they finally learned it, was Edward Rulloff. Almost nothing about him would turn out to be ordinary. The next morning belonged to the river. 2 swollen bodies were laid out on the bank for the town to identify, and a crowd gathered the way crowds do, half in horror and half in something close to satisfaction. One newspaper would report that the residents cheered, certain they were looking at the hand of justice itself. The surviving clerk, Gilbert Burroughs, told what he could. He had been knocked half senseless in the dark, and could not swear to the face of the man who held the gun, though he had felt him close enough to fight. That uncertainty would matter a great deal later on. While the bodies were still by the water, several men chased down a stranger near the railroad tracks at the edge of town. He had tried to lose them by darting across the rails ahead of a train, and when they cornered him, he was calm in a way that unsettled everyone who saw it. He gave his name as Charles Augustus. A little later, he gave it as George Williams. He said he was a lawyer, merely passing through. There was dried blood on his shirt, and a clumsy attempt had been made to ruin the garment. Yet he looked at the 2 drowned men without a flicker and swore he had never seen them in his life. In the pockets of the dead men, detectives found a set of keys, a scrap of paper bearing the name of a Brooklyn attorney, and, stranger still, a worn little book of fortunes that the burglar had carried like a talisman. For the moment, none of it was enough. A man being in town when a murder happens is not a crime. He very nearly walked away a second time. 2 small things kept him. The first was a boot. Down in the cellar of the store, among abandoned burglars' tools, lay a single shoe, oddly shaped, made for a foot that was missing 2 toes. The feet of the drowned men were whole. When someone recalled that the calm stranger had walked strangely, a deputy went back down the road after him and brought him in, and the boot was fitted to his foot, the way a slipper is fitted in a fairy tale. It matched. The second was a face. A local judge named Ransom Balcom came to look at the prisoner, and he did not need the boot at all. He had presided over an appeal years before, and he knew exactly who was standing in front of him. This, the judge announced, was Edward Rulloff, the man once tried for murdering his own wife and infant daughter, up in Lansing, a quarter-century earlier. The scrap of paper did the rest. It led detectives to Brooklyn, to a flat the prisoner had kept under yet another name, full of burglars' tools and stranger things besides, and from there the chain closed around him, link by link. The room had changed in that single instant of recognition. A botched burglary in Binghamton suddenly had a past that reached back 25 years, into a farmhouse near a cold blue lake. where a young woman and a baby had once lived and then had simply ceased to exist. To understand the man America would soon fight over, you have to go back to her. Her name was Harriet Shutt, and she came from a family of standing in Dryden, a farming town about 11 miles east of Ithaca. The Shutts were comfortable, respectable people, and they had plans for their daughter that did not include the new schoolmaster. He had arrived in the spring of 1842, charming and book-clever, claiming learning that no one in a country town could easily check. He took a post at a small subscription school, the kind a farming village kept going with a few dollars a term, and Harriet, barely 17, was among his pupils. By every account he was magnetic, and she fell hard. Her family did not. They thought him a pauper with awkward manners and far too high an opinion of himself, and they said so to his face and behind his back. On the last day of 1843, she married him anyway. It is worth pausing on the ordinary fact of her. Here was a bright girl from a good family, with options most young women of her time and place never had, who looked at a clever stranger and chose him over the people who had raised her. That choice was hers to make, and she made it with her whole heart. What she could not have known was how completely the world would lose track of her afterward, until the only thing left of Harriet Shutt was the crime that erased her, and the few small domestic facts that happened to survive it. The marriage went wrong behind a closed door, where the worst marriages of that century tended to stay. He was jealous past reason, fixed on the idea that Harriet preferred another man, a cousin and country doctor, named Bull. There was never any evidence of it beyond his own suspicion, but the suspicion was enough. Neighbors and a landlady would later remember that he struck her, that he spoke darkly of her family, that he once said he sometimes felt like destroying the whole household. Harriet did not complain to anyone. Women in 1845 rarely could. In the spring of that year, their daughter was born, and they named her Priscilla, after Rulloff's own mother. The little family had moved to Lansing by then, a few miles up the lake from Ithaca, close enough that a determined walker could reach town in about 90 minutes. Then, in the weeks before what came next, there was a smaller grief. Harriet's brother had a wife named Amelia and an infant of his own, and the two fell ill, and Rulloff, who fancied himself a man of medicine, attended them with his herbs. The baby died first, and the mother followed within days. Years afterward, when those graves were opened, traces of copper were found in what remained. Nothing was ever proven against him. But people in that country had long memories, and they did not forget. On the 23rd of June, 1845, Harriet borrowed soap from a neighbor. Her daughter, 3 months old, was in the house with her. A young girl who was there that day noticed nothing unusual, no packed trunk, no word of any journey, nothing to mark the date as anything but a washing day like 100 others. That borrowed soap is the last ordinary trace of her. That evening there was an argument over whether the family would move west so that he might finally rise in the world. What happened in those rooms after dark has never been settled, and it never will be. He would, much later, give more than one account of it, and the accounts did not agree even with one another. What is certain is only this. By the next morning, Harriet Shutt and her baby daughter were gone, and no one living has ever found them. He did not flee at once, which is among the stranger things about him. He stayed in town and offered explanations, and the explanations did not match. A neighbor was told the wife had left him of her own accord. The family heard that he had taken Harriet and the baby west to Ohio for a fresh start. When others pressed him harder, he allowed only that she was somewhere up in the lake country, vague as weather. The house told a plainer story. The skirt she had worn was on the floor. Her belongings sat where a living woman would have left them, and there was the matter of the wagon. Rulloff had borrowed a team and a large chest from neighbors, and he had been seen driving not toward any relative's home, but toward the shore of Cayuga Lake, returning with the chest still aboard. In time, the lake was dragged with chains and hooks and fishing nets. It gave up nothing then. It has given up nothing since. He ran at last through Geneva and Rochester and Buffalo, and was run to ground out west by his brother-in-law, Ephraim Shutt, who would not let the matter rest, and brought him back in irons. The town wanted him hanged. The law could not oblige it. This was the hard wall the case kept striking. Without a body, a grand jury in TRAGEDIUS would not return a charge of murder, no matter what every soul in Tompkins County believed in private. So the state convicted him of the only thing it could prove, the abduction of his own wife, and sent him to Auburn State Prison for 10 years at hard labor. A reward posted for the discovery of the bodies went unclaimed. The bodies stayed wherever he had put them. It should have been the end of him, and instead it was closer to a beginning. Auburn, in those years, was held up as one of the great humane experiments of the age. Reformers believed in it sincerely, and visitors were given tours to admire the order of the place. Its method was silence. Men were forbidden to speak, forbidden even to meet one another's eyes, set to labor from dawn until dark, and locked each night alone in a stone cell, scarcely larger than a closet. The silence itself was thought to be the cure, a decade of quiet, through which a man might be corrected by the slow pressure of his own conscience. Said a man who lived for words inside 10 years of enforced silence, and something curious begins to happen. Rulloff was remembered as a docile prisoner with a temper that flared at small slights, and he filled the long, wordless hours with study. He taught himself one language after another. He began to assemble a grand idea about where all human speech had come from, a single hidden method beneath every tongue ever spoken, lost to the world since ancient times, which he believed he alone was now recovering. Master that secret, he was certain, and he would stand among the most celebrated men who had ever lived. He walked out of Auburn in '86, convinced he was a genius the world had merely failed, so far, to notice. The first life had made him a convict. The prison had quietly made him a scholar. Neither one would ever again let go of the other. He did not walk out free. At the warden's office, on the very day of his release, a sheriff stood waiting with a fresh warrant for the murder of his wife. There followed a strange double season of his life. While the courts argued over whether he could even be tried, he was held in the county jail at Ithaca, and one winter night he simply vanished from it, past an ankle chain and 8 separate locks, which told everyone plainly that he had been helped from the inside. A reward went up at once, $500 to begin with, then more than twice that as the weeks passed and he stayed loose. Handbills described the fugitive for every county around. The learned murderer, they reported, stood about 5'9", with a thick neck and a strikingly large head. Those who had met him face to face remembered gentler things, small, sensitive hands, and black eyes that were said to shine like diamonds when he warmed to a subject. The man who had dreamed of fame in a prison cell now lived like a hunted animal in the open country. He foraged from farms and ate beech nuts in the cold, and that winter the frost took 2 of his toes. There is a grim symmetry in it. Those missing toes are exactly what would later shape a boot. The boot left in a cellar in Binghamton. The boot that would one day match his ruined foot and help to hang him. He was recaptured out west and hauled back to his old cell, and the law took up its tired problem once more. They tried him for murder again, moving the case to the county of Owego in search of a jury that had not already condemned him, and they convicted him. Then his lawyer, a young attorney named Francis Finch, carried the case up on appeal and won it on a single point of law. The point was this: a person's mere disappearance, however suspicious, cannot by itself prove that the person is dead, and a man cannot be hanged for a death the state has failed to prove. The higher court agreed. The verdict was set aside, and the principle passed into New York law, where it would be remembered for generations afterward as the Rulloff. A lynch mob gathered in the streets when the news spread, and he was taken out of Ithaca after dark and moved to Auburn for his own safety, before the state at last let him go. The irony sits at the very center of the case. The wife he had erased so completely that her body was never found became, in the end, the very reason the law could not touch him for her death. The thoroughness of the crime had become the proof of his innocence. He walked free, and the state, worn down and beaten, let him walk. In the Ithaca jail there had been a boy. His name was Albert Jarvis, the jailer's son, 16 years old, bright and lonely, and his parents had seen no harm in letting an educated prisoner tutor their son in Latin and Greek. The boy slept only a few feet from the cell. He came to look on Rulloff as something like a father, and over the years that followed Rulloff, shaped him into something far more useful than a son. He shaped him into an accomplice. Freedom did not turn Rulloff toward an honest living. It turned him back toward his great work, and the great work needed money. So the scholar became a thief of a particular kind, taking silk and fine cloth from the dry goods stores of New York and the towns beyond, goods that were valuable, portable, and hard to trace. And he taught young Jarvis the trade alongside the grammar. Their hours split between the reading rooms by day and the locked stores by night. A third man, a burglar named Billy Dexter, joined them out of the prisons. The manuscript grew through all of it, the work he believed would change the world and clear his name together. He offered it for sale at the astonishing price of $500,000. And when a gathering of genuine scholars at last sat down to weigh his ideas, they declined them without a single bid. He decided at once that the rejection was a conspiracy, an attempt to steal his genius before he could publish it himself. Through these years, Jane Jarvis, the boy's mother, who had long refused to believe such a charming man could be a murderer, helped him as she could and followed him to the city. Her son, the boy who had loved his Greek, would drown in a river before he reached 30, a few feet from the only father he had ever really known. So the country got its trial, in Binghamton, in the winter of 1871, and it swelled into a spectacle unlike almost anything that had come before. 2,000 people a day pressed into a courtroom built for half that number. The Binghamton papers, the Broom Republican, and the Democratic Leader and the Standard gave it page upon page, and a reporter came up all the way from the New York Sun. Feeling in the town ran so hot that the lawyer for the defense was threatened, and witnesses for the defense were said to have been frightened into silence. Rulloff conducted much of his own defense, cross-examining the witnesses with a lawyer's ease. His argument was that the killing, if he had been present for it at all, had come out of a struggle and not out of any intent to murder. The boot in the cellar spoke against him, and so did a torn piece of newspaper found in his rooms that matched one dropped in the escape, and so did Burroughs, who could not name his face but could place him in the dark. The jury debated only how guilty he was, and it returned the worst answer, and he was sentenced to die on the 3rd of March. Even then, he tried one more turn. Brought to Elmira to be sentenced afresh after his appeals failed, he admitted at last that he had been one of the 3 thieves in the store, while swearing that the fatal shot had been fired by one of the companions who had drowned. The confession did far more to settle the public's doubts than to save him. Then the strangest thing of all began. The nation started to argue over whether it had any right to hang him. Horace Greeley, the famous editor, urged that so rare an intellect ought not be wasted on a gallows. From near Buffalo, a young writer named Mark Twain sent a letter to the Tribune, half in earnest and half in mischief, offering to furnish a substitute to be hanged in Rulloff's place, because, as he wrote, a marvelous mind was about to be sacrificed, with half its secrets still unknown. Scholars came from Harvard and Yale to test him in Greek and went away arguing, and even Elizabeth Cady Stanton confessed she could not look away. Some men of learning swore he was a true genius. Others called him a humbug, a clever fraud who could produce the right Latin phrase, and nothing solid behind it, and 2 such examiners published precisely that verdict the day before he died. He read it in his cell, and it wounded him. Through all of it, he kept an unnerving composure. Asked by a reporter whether he believed in providence, he answered that religion must be a matter of faith and not of knowledge, and that the decrees of God were past all understanding. A commission was appointed to weigh his sanity, and he made a point of proving to it that his mind was perfectly sound, preferring, it seemed, to die a genius than to live thought a madman. Governor John Hoffman heard every plea for mercy and refused them all. On the 18th of May, 1871, in the yard of the Broome County Jail, they hanged him. He had asked that there be no prayers, and his wish was honored. His last words, by the soberest account, were only that he could not stand still, spoken as he struggled to keep his balance with his arms bound and his head already hooded. The drop did not do its work cleanly, and even the manner of his dying is one more thing the record cannot agree upon. It is enough to say that it was not quick, and that a crowd which had come for a clean ending did not get one. Society was not finished with him even then. A plaster mask was taken of his face, and his body was put on public display, and one local count had nearly 6,600 people file past to look at the most remarkable criminal of the age, fewer than 600 of them from Binghamton itself. When no relative came to claim him, his brain was given to a professor at Cornell named Bert Wilder, who measured it, pronounced it a marvel, and kept it. Wilder was building a collection of brains in those days, hundreds of them in time, in the belief that the shape and weight of the gray matter might explain the soul. Rulloff's sits there to this day, in a glass jar on a shelf in Uris Hall, a few minutes' walk from a tavern that still bears his name. A man who had been certain his mind would one day make the world forgive him received, in the end, exactly that much of his wish. His brain, behind glass, in a jar. The young clerk had no such strange afterlife. Frederick Myrick was carried home to Walton, up in the Delaware County hills, and buried in the village ground he had left to go and seek his fortune in the city. But the question the whole story was built upon was never really his. It belonged to the 2 people he took out of the world on a washing day in 1845, and never once explained. There is a last, strange coda to set beside the jar. Within a year of his death, a newspaper carried a report that a young woman, about 25 years old, was living quietly under another name and keeping a hotel at a place called Parker's Landing. She had been raised, the story went, by Rulloff's own brother. She believed the murderer had been nothing more than her uncle, though there was talk in her county that she was something else entirely. The paper called it an improbable story, and improbable it may well have been. No one ever proved it true, and no one ever proved it false, so this is where it all comes to rest. Harriet Shutt has no grave. Her daughter has, at most, a rumor and a name in a county that has long since forgotten her. And Edward Rulloff carried whatever he knew of the 2 of them down into a silence as deep and as cold as the lake, and he left the rest of us standing on the shore, wondering still whether the one life he never confessed to had somehow, against everything, outlived him.